Hello everyone, today we talk about early medieval free peasantry, aristocracy, and nobility on a timeline stretching from, in fact, around 500 to 1000 AD, right? So it's a lot of stuff, and we will make, as we already have at some point, in fact, some videos that are more specifically regional, right? They focus on a single century, etc. But especially after the couple of videos I made recently on late antiquity, city and countryside, and more a paradigm shift, I think it's important to take a look at this specific, especially in the very early centuries of the early Middle Ages, what we would call the so-called Dark Ages, if anything. The only dark thing there being the fact that they're objectively less documented, yes, and surely they weren't much better times than before or afterwards. And this is in part what the historiographical debate not much revolves around, because it's one of those moments in history in which you have to simply to surrender to the fact that there are too few sources, and however that this specifically means something about that world, right? We have already discussed actually the early Middle Ages, the demographic, economical contraction in so many videos, as we have also made many videos about the latter part. We all arrive in fact to the 10th century, the beginning of encapsulation, so the birth of a different type of aristocracy compared to the one of the previous centuries. That, as we'll see now, it's somehow also difficult, at least in some cases, to define. At least as much as the juridical relations were involved with other elements of society, and especially the free peasantry. And as we'll see now, this is an incredibly I wouldn't say hard or controversial or difficult topic, but it's really one where you have to stay pretty focused, because for most people, the Middle Ages, of course, begin with this kind of once upon a time, without a further background, that there was this world where, there were free peasants out there living freely and, happily and, unspoiled and all this stuff. This is naturally, given that our focus, of course, concentrates also on where most people lived at the time. So fundamentally in Western Europe, and in areas that had been part of the Roman Empire, by the way, with all the consequences of the case, something you have always relate to the a much, let's say, lots of other things that had happened before. And we have seen that indeed the concepts of tabula rasa, for which, the West falls, so everything falls of what existed before, and civilization simply rebooted, or at least restarted from some sort of different basis that can make you take out of the picture what occurred before. What fundamentally these bases were in continuity with before is not really a wise approach. But there was a time in history when, especially the 19th century, when this was discussed heavily for reasons that we will explain now, because they're very ideological. So I'm my topic choice is purely random, but I'm glad that this randomness brought this topic specifically after the one about the late antiquity, the shrinking of the empire, and so on, because it's somehow consequential. We will look at this stuff in many other videos as well. Just for the record, I made some video last year that is very connected with this by a degree, which was about Longobarд history, and specifically the passage from essentially from serfdom to the Massari, right, from the colony to the Massari. I think the title was especially that one, which highlights at least the phenomenon as far as the Longobard kingdom is concerned. I made, I think, a general video about the re-expansion of forests, the uncultivated terrain. So there is something out there. There is a playlist specifically titled Medieval Countryside and Rural History or something like that, or Medieval Peasantry as well. So this video will probably fit also in the both in Medieval Peasantry and Medieval Aristocracy playlists, right? Because at least the aristocracy part later on is somehow less controversial. The important is to focus what happened in the 6th and in the 7th century. Then the rest is kind of more history again, because it's better documented, fundamentally. But the beginnings are important. And the organization of landed estates is not just a guide to the, to economical activities, right? We don't study history in function of economics, but if anything, economics, together with lots of other things, in function of the broader picture that is fundamentally political, right? Economics is just a part of the social issue, fundamentally. And these, in fact, are the most important indicators. There is also actually a third element, which is the military one. Today we will not focus particularly on it, but it's also important to understand who were, say, how clienteles worked, and the military function, of course, was there. You can understand lots of things politically and socially depending on who were, I don't know, the Antrustiones, for example, or the Gazindi, right? This is really important. And we will see the part now. So what is also crucial in this picture is analyzing, it sounds banal enough, but the agrarian world. And however, more specifically, from the point of view of the, let's call them independent peasants, right? So we have seen what happened tendentially with the end of the Western Roman Empire. That, of course, that statile machine existed before, somehow shrank. In some places, it fundamentally evaporated. In some others, basically kept working, right? In the most advanced contexts, and even when it was reshaped naturally, it was an administration that fundamentally continued from Roman times, passing in the hands of the either of the church and or of these new aristocracies, which were still fundamentally mostly in this space Romano-Germanic. So they were a blend fundamentally between people who had been ruling the place and the newcomers that were coming to rule and effectively to share power, right, with the locals. This is important. This is quite relevant because from one side it is, and it's already a huge historiographical issue, because it's possible that the free peasants had benefited from the among the other social, let's say at least the most within the other social groups, from the crisis of the Western Roman tax system, right? In a sense, because from that point they, in theory, didn't have to pay any more the taxes that were owed to that through that statal machine. The point, though, that we don't know, and this is the huge question mark, because you see where this is going, right? That there is a lot of ideologies, and maybe we'll see it better from 19th century historiography regarding what happened concretely. That is to say, yes, the system collapsed, but did people really live better after that? Because this is not clear at all. At least we do not have any specific evidence of that. We just see actually widespread misery, material poverty. It's true that Eurasia was undergoing the world, say, a significant contraction. We see it in all the great civilizations. Fundamentally, they underwent very similar dynamics at this point. Think about China with the barbarians, the collapse of a central state, and all these things. But what about the collapse of the latifundia? First of all, I made, I think, enough videos over the years stressing, importantly enough, the differences between Gaul and Spain from one side and Britain and Italy from the other, right? Because Gaul and Spain fundamentally maintained a greater continuity with the Roman latifundia. So because these were countries that didn't basically undergo major destruction and the destructuration of the previous system, Britain and Italy, the latter after the Gothic War particularly, really did, right? So naturally these countries are very different from one another. For example, as we'll see now, Gaul is notoriously much better documented than the Iberian Peninsula, right? And this creates lots of problems because, again, the fact that an area is less documented than another is always meaningful as far as political social relations are concerned, but it's, let's say, never a good sign, just per se. The same goes between Britain and Italy, right? Yes, the latifundia system may have collapsed, but Britain fundamentally was parceled at that point with lots of different polities that took many centuries to kind of put together a kind of more comprehensive administrative system, whereas the Italian peninsula basically just saw a remolding of the geographical areas of pertinence, specifically with the Longobards and the Byzantines, and fundamentally a statile administrative system remained standing. Doesn't matter how resized, and naturally Britain was much poorer than Italy in general, where you see that actually per capita things improved, but they had already been high since Roman times, and so the thing went on as a primate in the world until the 17th century in the region. So there are huge divides, right? Just even within the same Gaul, right? Northern Gaul was something, right? It was more Germanized, barbarous. It remained Romance, of course, and was even there a continuity with the cities, with the administration, but nothing comparable with Occitania, Southern Gaul, the Mediterranean coastland, right? And the same can be said for Spain by a degree. The plateau, where actually also the seat of Visigothic power is located, was never fully in control, for example, of the south, which was the most Romanized, urbanized, fertile, rich, demographically dense, concentrated area in the region, and that's where, in fact, the Emirate of Cordoba would have been installed. Then there is a northeastern part that is also deeply Romanized, and it's somehow different from the Toledan area. So we can trace all the differences that we want, even for not talking within Gaul, and also beyond this war. So we can't talk about them all, right? But this picture, the essentials, the fundamentals of this, again, I made lots of videos about this, should be clear. If you are not familiar with them, just go check my Migration Era playlist or Medieval Society. You will find all the necessary there. There is another medieval playlist as well, which can be useful, because it packs together a bit all the various topics. Anyhow. So, again, the idea that the Roman states, and so the latifundia fundamentally, and so that the colonists turn, as they de facto did, into freemen once again, becoming per capita wealthier than before, is let's say, at least tendentially, does make a lot of sense. The point is that we don't know how much wealth was around in absolute terms to make the comparison, right? And civilizationally speaking, from what we see in the Latin Germanic world at this point, there is not much to hint at the fact that, in spite of this regional differences, and still a brutal continuity, with especially in the Mediterranean, with essentially what antiquity had been, we don't see an overbearing amount of wealth. Now some say that this is because the elites were poorer, and so just documentarily, archaeologically, etc., we can see less, but we don't know about the average person. There would be like a huge digression to start, now, but it's not this video. What this video is about, I will have to answer this question in another video alone, because it's unanswerable, like in a few minutes. And this is what still, however, scholars debate, widely. Not that there is a big mystery behind this, we have to rewrite that history. No, it's just that, again, we understand it was probably not a very developed situation. We just would like to know much more, especially at the local level, what was going on politically and socially. And we have a few sources to do that. In all likelihood, in this early medieval times, aristocracy had not substituted itself to the state to exercise such an equal power like the Roman emperors had on the population. It's obvious, because there is nothing comparable, civilizationally speaking. And again, this is not necessarily a positive sign overall, right? It's as if you said, now imagine a major Western country collapsed, imagine, say, wealth was more redistributed because elites collapsed, and say at least individuals compared to one another somehow in more equal terms, but overall the system collapsed, and still you lost an overwhelming amount of wealth just from out of that, right? So one must be extremely cautious in drawing the conclusion that this was somehow a positive dimension, that there was some kind of ethical superiority in this system. Actually, we don't get any picture of that. On the contrary, we see an aristocracy that is very often much more in trouble because is fundamentally a warlike one. They beat each other constantly, and there is just, and kings make a great effort just to make them stop in the first place, and trying to reestablish, in fact, a public state of sort to make things work well once again. And especially if you study the legal, like the juridical production at this time, this is quite evident, right? We'll quote a pair of sources now. What we're witnessing here is the aftermath of still by a substantial degree of civilizational collapse, right? The aristocracy would have taken over, and we see this quite easily because, for example, in Gaul, where most latifundia were, as we've seen, intact after all, right, with all the changes that had occurred, but that did not collapse again, like after the Gothic War in the Italian peninsula, or after what happened, which was a pretty ugly thing anyway, even though we don't know exactly. Even before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, right, properly in the Romano-Brittonic society that redrew all the land plots, it was basically a revolution of some sort happening there, and a violent one. So that's why it doesn't look great, a positive thing. And we see that the Merovingians immediately take over, like together with the Gallo-Roman Church, because those were the elites that essentially the same senatorial families that had remained there before the arrival of the Franks, take over the system intact. And that's also why much of medieval chivalry and feudalism and whatever stems from that, because they were already there was already that elite with very, very few very, very rich people that fundamentally passed unchanged from. But there was a tendency even there in the Celtic world, comparatively in Gaul, in the rest of the Celtic world, and the Romans developed this further, and then again the Merovingians basically affirmed that, and later French feudalism basically consolidates this in the way that we know. And in that sense, elites are dramatically powerful, right? An average unknown Gallic magnate was richer, say, privately speaking, than a Lombard king. Right, and this is not a positive thing in itself, because it means that all the rest of the people were poorer. In fact, Gaul, again, altogether was richer than Italy, but their society would say that the average person there was poorer than the average Italian. This is quite fascinating, and it allowed the Longobards, in fact, to develop what was a real public system, a state that worked, where the dukes were literate, they administered justice, then competition aristocratically was only within the city offices, because these aristocrats were too poor compared to the average freeman to do more than that, or to attempt like a secession, a sort of privatization, the creation of a clienteling system of feudal nature. So the system was much more stable. So we have documented all these things very clearly elsewhere, right? The Franks eventually managed to different waves between a collapse and another to reactivate the system militarily, and so they developed professional military clienteles on the base of the fact, again, that those very few rich people could go at war with a hell of a collective training that no other country in Europe could provide at that point, and reconquering basically most of, what great areas of course of Western, of Central, and Southern Europe, right? That's another chapter. But to give you a dimension of what the outcome of this social differences actually was, also politically wise. So, in general, it's not clear at all if in the confusion generated by the invasions, the Roman aristocracy had, first of all, maintained her general dominion, because in some areas, like in southern Gaul, in southern Spain especially, again, there is a great continuity with Romanity, and that still, however, fell into a Romano-Germanic context at that point, because still were part nominally of either, the Burgundian kingdom, the Visigothic kingdom, and so on. And on the other hand, it would take time before the new Germanic elites would be able, in fact, to establish their own hegemony, and the result was a hybrid, a synthesis of the two. Because initially, these populations were settled as federati. Basically, they weren't even technically given land as such. They would find it themselves, especially in areas that were also depopulated, very often were not even actually the better ones, because in the better ones the Romans remained, and they were more overwhelmingly, from a numerical point of view, mostly they controlled the strategic areas, the mountain passes, things like this, and so they mostly received what was the annona to maintain from the flatlands, from the fertile areas, to maintain their own military control. Like, the fact they substituted themselves to their local provincial armies, right? And they were supplied in the same identical way, including with the Roman arms and armor and all this stuff. So in many ways, it was even a much smoother process than we tend to think, right? There wasn't even a major crack, right? The major cracks occurred only if there were major wars that were nobody's interest, as far as if you have to settle in somebody's land, you don't want to lose that somebody in terms of manpower, of production. It's silly, right? So things like the Gothic War were obviously a foreign invasion at that point of a Byzantine power into a Romano-Germanic Italy. We've made a video about that, the Rome between the two Gothic sieges, explaining exactly this and how much this tension inherent in the relation between the king and the freemen at that point really was becoming. Because they saw the opportunity of unhinging the latifundium system and to have a more equal redistribution of resources on that base. Now, as we were saying before, it's possible that the great, say at least the relative material poverty of the early medieval times is widened by, again, the fact that elites as such were poorer than in Roman times, so they could build and do less. However, again, if it's so much wealth had been around, it's likely that, as it would happen on the long run, however, that this system would reactivate still on the base of a very powerful elite, the feudal one. So, and there are even similar comparisons with the Roman one in many ways, at least in terms of scale of wealth and so on. So the whole thing is, yet again, if you don't make a local history, you don't to draw the differences between the various regions. It's kind of a vague concept. In any case, this hypothesis, as we'll explain now, doesn't have to be taken as, the early Middle Ages was such a prosperous time. Just, there weren't the terrible elites that could self-represent themselves in the sources for us to study them. No, this is, not correct. There's no evidence of that. Just by, we know what material culture was also as far as the poor people were concerned. Right, and we know that, but we know it from many sources, right, from a geography, for instance, that poverty was there, that the world had changed dramatically, and that, especially in the second half of the 6th century, in the first half of the 7th century, was a sense of great difficulty and hardship and lack of resources, and a dramatic one. There had been the plague, there had been a wide depopulation. You can argue that at least the migration by the end of the 6th century in the West were over, and mostly they had been carried out by semi-civilized people, because the Germanic migrations at that point, as we've explained many times, were fundamentally compatible with Romanity. Central, Eastern Europe, those places were really something different just from an historical time that I don't have really even to explain again, but it's kind of self-evident really what happened throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. So we can look at especially the legislation of the 6th and of the 7th century to assess the extent of this, right? With the Franks, fundamentally, the most important ones are the Franks, with the Pactus Legis Salice, and the Longobards with Rotary's Edict in 643. Also, the Anglo-Saxons, interestingly enough, left us something which is, at least, in all these, this is essentially, yes, the Franks, the Longobards, the Anglo-Saxons, legislations give us, for the times and places, a rich amount of details relative specifically to norms to apply to productive peasants. Right? These people must have had a certain political weight in the first place so that it could be worth of the pain promulgating and preserving such laws. Right? You understand what I mean? The resources were scarce, right? So these people at the bottom of society weren't tremendously powerful, but they literally were the basis of how any kingdom, any polity could work, right? Through the surplus, through the workforce, and through also the manpower, militarily speaking, right? So they were very important to maintain. Because especially the cleverest, let's say, in the areas where there was a kind of a greater sense of civilization and public authority and statal administration, it was perfectly understood by the monarchs that by keeping these people somehow equally free and not making, again, some powerful private clienteles emerging that could counter, also compete with royal power from rising and preventing them from rising, was, of course, the most important thing to look forward in order to consolidate further a statal power, right? So it's the same concept through which the Roman Empire had been born. I mean, there was this strong sense of the right of the Roman citizens that were powerful people because freedom, in these words, equated to nobility. For the Romans, for the Germans, being free meant literally you're a nobleman, right? Not that you're a nobleman in the sense that you're richer than others. It means that sacrally, right, spiritually, if you can bear arms, you are blessed with a degree of divinity, and so that's what the nobility is about. It's nobility of the people is about. Naturally, when you read these codes in the 6th and the 7th century, that sense of equality is actually already very eroded, because there was no strong state, as we've seen, just to maintain those rights in the first place. So it's not much of a romantic picture as we could imagine. It's more like the fact that literally there was not enough surplus also in most situations to produce very powerful elites, right? Except in mostly the Frankish world, right, and a bit in the Visigothic one, right? So, in fact, those are the countries that are also less sensitive, generally speaking, to this sense of the tradition of the people in arms that instead is very well put on the fore, for example, in the Lombard law, which meant at the end of the day still a sort of aristocracy electing the kings, which made it, for example, the Lombard kingdom the only functional elective monarchy out there, right? Look at what happened to the Visigoths, basically, where the kings in Toledo were just controlled by the rest of the nobility, and the system was so fragile when the Arabs arrived. The fact that the English didn't even have a unitary kingdom, or it could be recognized as such until the 10th century. The Franks again turned into a series of lordships. Basically, it was all the kings, the royal family's power, and basically it was a matter of bloodline, of sacredness of just the Merovingian dynastic blood. And even though they, of course, called themselves the kings of the Franks, they had been building the most brutally elitistic and successful, as far as this rejuvenation, or at least the military clienteles, under a single leader at some point. If he was able to knock out the others, simply having the luck of remaining the only living son, could be reactivated, could be employed also against other peoples, and so on. So, if you read these sources, it's clear that the independent peasants in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms were dealt with as if, at least in theory, there had not been any lord that could put himself between them and the king. Right. The other observation that can be done, however, is that in reality, such laws do not talk about signory in the first place, and in order to understand what that could mean, one also must make an effort to enter properly in the Germanic juridical mindset. Because the Germans were coming from a world without a state, right? So every clan was supposed to be autonomous, and nobody could whine that if they would lose simply their own freedom, because at the end of the day they would have somehow deserved that at some point. So naturally, when they established themselves, they settled down in the Roman world, and they began to be just landed owners, and then to permanent ones, where they had to interact with a royal justice. It was a political territorial power, so something completely new that was mostly, in fact, of Roman, essentially of Roman derivation. They began to take care to contrast the fact that a true German should have not even should have simply proven to be free without asking anybody else, right? And the kings from their side were just to guarantee, in a sense, that nobody would rise, in fact, too much more than the others, because the king was seen as the only person that could, by some degree and shift that we'll talk about now in this sacred understanding of power, was brutally affirmed, actually, once the Germans settled down, something that they had always tried to counter as far as they were in the Barbaricum. Could intervene in making justice, fundamentally, recomposing mostly the feuds within the people, also violently but quickly, right? Because if the people was divided, it was perceived to be weak, legitimately, from a political military point of view. The truth being, however, that doesn't matter how much these laws are saying we do this for the tradition of our ancestors, our forefathers, like this law, which everybody's free, etc. Actually, it's, first of all, just for the fact that it would write it down in Latin, and that this would be extended as basically to anyone in the country, that by the overwhelming majority was Roman, by the way, was meaning something there that was just by itself coming from a very different background. It was coming from surely from the cultural hegemony of a Germanic tradition, politically and juridically. But the ratios of power were completely different from the ones that had, again, existed in Central Europe. Because people had land now, and land is something that gives you so much power, and that just culturally, tribally, you're not prepared to cope with, because basically you're just, if you want to evolve, to develop, you have to go past the tribe in order to structure that political power in an effective way. And this is exactly what the kings were trying to do, to maintain a balance between the two things, trying to elevate themselves as kings, but keeping the aristocracy down, still trying to counter it whenever possible the ability of this aristocracy to take over the others, in order to at least tie them to the monarchy in a way or another, if this was, as it was, de facto unavoidable. So these considerations are very crucial, because the sense of the freedom, especially the freedom, not even the liberty, right? The freedom of the peasant class, the freemen, right, is one of those historiographical cliches that of nationalistic romantic metrics of the probably even the early 19th century, not even how medievalistics developed throughout still quite nationalistic time during the 11th, right? And this, unsurprisingly, was especially expressed from a German background, because of course at the time, with the affirmation of the German nation, they must affirm things like that. They were talking about authors also of great names from the Monumenta Germania Historica, such as Georg Weitz, Georg von Maurer, up to including Alphonse Dobsch, right? So historians that saw the free peasantry of the early Middle Ages as the foundation of the originary German freedom, right? And so the sense, of course, of how Germany had developed in the Middle Ages, which was a federal in nature, fundamentally because there the public structures had failed to prevail, differently from England or from France, or the Spanish, the Iberian monarchies. It would be also in here very interesting to digress on this topic, because it's really fascinating to see where these historians were coming from with that, right? How historiography really was at that time, or basically it wasn't, because nobody had ever studied these things seriously up to that point. So there were many different positions that would oppose them, because that's how it happened. They expressed this idea because they had to show again that there was a sense of primal virtuous meaning in the original tribal Germanic reality, and so full of some kind of eventually gravitate with political and also even civil consequences of some sort. But eventually, this thing was soon debunked, right? Because first of all, times changed from a side, but also history went on in parallel. So we're lucky enough that the civilization continued, because in two world wars and a Cold War, things could go differently, at least. And historians simply began to analyze these juridical documents and realizing that we know a very few about what those systems were actually about, what these alleged freedoms would have been. And by this point, we're pretty well aware of the fact that there was a great continuity of power of aristocracy throughout all the early Middle Ages. So the romantic myth of the the freemen from the Gemeinschaft that arrives in this new land and carves out a plot out of himself where he prospers with his family in the nature and the purity of it is, say, it's not even that it never existed, but it was a much more miserable picture than we could depict it, and especially it mostly occurred in the least developed and the more fringe, less advanced areas of Europe. And they didn't live well at all. Right? Actually, it was a nightmare in many ways. And I made lots of videos about the creation of, let's say, of the seigneurial system, right? So how the thing happened, and it's very connected with this because it basically showed the surpassing of that idea, even a political, juridical idea or theory of freedom of some sort, which is never also particularly actually expressed by the sources. I mean, freedom was mostly to protect, but you can easily understand, because I had the privilege of studying some of these sources in some depth, and you realize that what these kings were doing was just trying to keep the system from falling apart. Right, so they were just doing that minimum that could keep them staying afloat and maintaining this order. And generally speaking, the feudalization of the system doesn't correspond much to the success of it either, after all. Because at least this theory turned into something else. Right. So there was another... So as you understand, the peoples that studied the most these topics were the Germans and the Italians in the 19th and the 20th century. And this has a lot to do with the Romano-Germanicness of the whole thing, the fact that up to the 19th century were within the Holy Roman Empire themselves, they were the most relevant cultures from the area, academically, etc. So in order to counter that sense of nationalistic view of the thing, that there was there was another theory. It was advanced by Theodor Mayer and Heinrich Dannenbauer in Germany, and by Giampiero Bognetti in Italy. That is to say, the one of the freemen, or let's say maybe of all the freemen in the kingdom, it would configure themselves de facto as a category, a particular category of royal dependents of some sort. That is to say, the royal freemen. Now, this idea was interesting because it was based on the concept that there was some sort of degree of freedom, which indeed existed, right? And even because technically in tradition, and in the sense that the Romano-Germanic laws are already an approximation from that, every person had a different worth, right? So even though there are classes that also corresponded to classes of recruitment that were based on landed property, right? Still, the idea is that every person, notoriously, in a juridical field, they had a different price, right? So the idea is that if you were just like freer than other people, let's put it in this way, you were more likely to be connected with the king. Because the idea is that the king was there because it was in theory elected by the free people in arms, in the assembly, in the thing, right? The people in arms, the exercitus, right? That would confer such royal sacrality to a leader that had to maintain the order, and that thus would just be a medium with God through which the imperium was dispensed, right? And so socially, this would turn out in a sort of, the king's guy, right? I work for him, I fight for him, and that's basically a category. But also this theory has been abandoned, after especially the demolishing criticism of Giovanni Tabacco and of another number of German scholars. Today, historians tend to, let's say, accept, of course, the coexistence of independent, say, free peasants and of aristocrats at the same time, next to each other in all early medieval societies, right? Because in every part of Europe you can find aristocratic assets next to lands held by subjects of very varied social extraction, such as, for example, the village elites that were people who basically didn't cultivate their own land. Because in theory, like the tradition was that a freeman doesn't work. In order to be a freeman, you don't work, right? This is something that gets down to the Celts, the Germans, the Romans. The idea, again, if you're truly free, it's because somebody else will work for you, because you're so superior to anybody else that just by, the deterrent presented, again, by your spear, right, by your gladius, by the cingulum militaris, you embody basically the master of some sort. At least people will simply work for you or on your behalf and will provide you with a surplus with defending them. So this is conceptually in tradition already a proto-signory, right? And even when we look at the highly civilized and kind of legal, kind of juridically developed Roman Empire, we think of that as a sort of republic where people had sclerotized the idea of a abstract freedom. This was absolutely not there. The Roman Empire itself was considered a sort of feudal empire, where the Romans were at the top and the others were maintaining them as a people in arms, right? So also the nationalistic counterposition between the Romans and the Germans made a lot of damage, because simply it counterposed to alleged cultural civilizational divides that weren't there, and you can easily see throughout all this period that, of course, say the equivalent of the senator with the latifundia still remained by some degree, scattered everywhere, right? There are the richer people of the community that are more than the others. And the interesting aspect of this is that this state of things existed also before the Germanic migrations in Central Europe, because the Germans of Tacitus weren't the Germans of late antiquity, right? Germany had undergone significant changes. There had already been, before the migration, also by Roman osmosis to a degree, but mostly the normal compaction of a more civilized reality, just the idea that there is a hierarchy, that society gets more structured and specialized and functionalized. And of course, most Germans, we call them semi-nomads because at a time they moved, right? And they also mixed with peoples coming from the steppes. But they were technically farmers, right? So the average freeman was actually a guy that had already by far past the days in which, if they ever existed, he was just a freeman in arms and could afford just a bunch of slaves to work for him. Because that reality likely never even existed, right? Or at least he would have been less of a freeman than somebody else. And the interesting aspect that I always point out, as we'll see now, is that paradoxically, it's exactly in those lands that people turned out to be less free at the end of this period, because there was no public authority to check that system, to that further kind of privatization and aristocratization. And so when we look at the time of the Germanic confederacies, when they settled in the Roman lands, they were already hegemonized by a few clans, a few dynasties already. I mean, this is very evident. Look at, I don't know, the Amalie among the Goths, or the same Merovingians among the Franks. I mean, that they had to strive to reach there, to that point, but it was done at the expense of the freedom of their own connationals, and when they settled down, they became a fully sanitarized people in lands that had a much greater surplus than the ones where they originally came from. They had matured their culture. Of course, this thing accelerated further, and so that's what we're actually seeing in early medieval times. This is not even a negative thing, right? The ideological assumption was that people remained free for such a long time, and this was a positive thing. And when you actually measured that, it's not a matter of freedom in the sense of relative relations with somebody else. It's also how absolutely well off you are, even when you are basically under somebody else's power. Right? This is a very important concept to understand. It's like saying, for example, that this is an easy example. The peasantry in the Middle Ages was freer politically than in the modern age. But can you say that an average medieval peasant was actually better off than an average modern peasant, like in terms of just quality of life? This is difficult to claim. Right? The same goes for the Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages allegedly had this great freedom of the peasantry, but was it actually a better time to live, or a better situation or condition to live out there in the wild with, again, a lord that could still come there and take you over? Right? The idea is that these freemen would have been capable of joining forces against those who wanted to challenge their own power. This occurred in Central Europe by a degree, at least we see it. There was a general distrust toward the aristocracy, but those we knew took over anyway. In the early Middle Ages, generally speaking, see the social prominence of the cavalrymen. Right, the cavalry is not yet fully decisive on the battlefield, but it's superior to infantry. There is no doubt about that. And those were not the average person, even though ideally, even, for example, the Longobards or the Visigoths still in the 8th century depicted themselves as if they were horsemen. And the Franks even praised them, saying, "Oh, look at these guys, they were objectively the peoples that were like being more east than the Franks historically were more equestrians, but at that time the Carolingians had already a much better cavalry than the Longobards and the Visigoths." So we don't have to be tricked even by the cultural representations of these same peoples, their traditions, their nostalgias, their myths, because reality, we know, was also something else. And this was surely a way to politically also trick and to actually let things, because again, if the idea is that you are what you do, if you are poor or you lose your freedom or whatever, which can happen, isn't it your fault? Right? Who's going to save you? Right? These peoples didn't come from an idea that it was a state that had to fix that. You had to do it on your own by convincing the others. And if this didn't happen on the long run, it's as if their own same concept was applied. Right? They were abiding to their own rules, in theory. Naturally, every civilized context recognized that there was an authority that had to check on this. Right? So that's what the advancement in civilization really consists of in the first place. For many reasons now, I don't have even the time to digress, but I think it's self-evident. I mean, it's the concept that if you make these people too poor, unless you develop a more centralized system where still the elite has to take over everything and making a gigantic effort to preserve everything standing, you're going to crumble as a society, which is basically what happened to all these ones except to the Franks, because they were so ultra-elite, privatistically oriented, that they simply skipped all the balance calculation. They were just so far off from the other side that they created a less equal society, but at the same time it was so powerful that altogether that it was able to elevate also the level of again, maybe not the average and individual level to above some of other regions of Europe, but still they became more military powerful. I mean, France became the strongest power in Europe. It made civilization and still benefited from its own monarchism in a sense. So we can't make all the history of these things in the millennia, but here we are, and still we are somehow the product of both things, balancing each other out. There were also simply these small landowners cultivating their own land plots, right? In other words, in every village, the small landowners and the tenants, the latter independently from being free or not, which is also something that at some point doesn't make much sense. It wasn't like a stamp saying, okay, you're free or not free. Again, it came from the midst of a general appreciation, but all these people, in fact, could live one next to the other, right? At least, and especially in those areas in which the landed property was fraction, right? Because feudalism also brought to a better definition of certain boundaries, as you know. But the landowners and the tenants in these places lived, after all, in similar ways. Again, there was not much surplus in these first centuries. So we're looking mostly at domestic structures of nuclear type and based horizontal nets of parentage and of neighborhood, right? They followed similar agricultural practices, which means, from one side, that they were still cohese according to an idea of, yes, that's mostly what our common condition is. But interestingly enough, this wouldn't make them more powerful, really. It's like big saying, look at what happened to the Anglo-Saxons against the Normans, or look at what happened to the Longobards against the Carolingians. Right, those were more equal societies, but they weren't more functional to at least the extension of political power also over other peoples. Right, they could have developed like that. They did develop like that in many ways, but the Franks, they were the most unequal society, surpassed everyone. Right, again, eventually building up on that. So I'm not saying, okay, we should simply start enslaving people and hoping that works. Again, there was a great continuity also. Some peasant autonomy in some areas of the Frankish world. This is not to say that it was just slavery or whatever. But it was also an exception in the degree of the balance. Today, for example, again, you couldn't propose a country that works like that, because most countries, we know the fact of, the less free you are, the shittier that power really is, right? So that's pretty self-evident all over the world, and all even authoritarian or even dictatorial systems, eventually, if they grow by any degree, that they tend to liberalize, because it's not in their interest to keep closing, to be closing that way. The reason why they have to hold on in that kind of strange way is just to emerge. Then they have to necessarily liberalize, otherwise the system would collapse within itself. In any case, going back to this high Middle Ages now, the villages could be an interesting indicator of how, let's say, of this kind of freedom, because some villages were considered free and some not free. For example, and also the people within that by some degree. For example, in the 9th century, there are cases, so we're talking about Carolingian times, in which the dependent tenants were trying to demonstrate their own personal freedom. And it was on that occasions mostly the free neighbors of theirs to witness that the contrary was true. This happened, for example, there was a famous case in 822 in a long phase of the struggle between the peasants of Limonta on the Common Lake and their lord, which was the monastery of St. Ambrose in Milan. as you understand, here you have literally the evidence of what was going on. I mean, you could play with somebody else's perception of freedom. What did it mean to be free? I mean, what did it mean by the beginning of the 9th century? After again the Italic kingdom had been conquered by the Carolingians, like to prove that, say, one community from where had been traditionally free and another wasn't. Right. Of course, there would also be some promotions throughout this time. There were some communities that made it out, especially even throughout the most turbulent times, like in the 10th century, to gain more autonomy as peasants. It was a peasant community that maybe was not even free originally. So there were so many issues about this because the divide between freemen and not freemen had a relevance also in a constitutional sense, because the kingdom of the Franks and the one of the Longobards were clearly founded on an ideal relation between the king and the free male population overall, right? The juridical collections are very clear. They could be very different societies, but the idea is that if you were recognized as a freeman by the king, this was the deal, you had some greater role in the system, especially in the Longobard case, right? And this was known by the Carolingians too in Italy, because they cared particularly about maintaining that balance that the Longobard kings had. And that's why Charlemagne also took the crown of the Longobards, because he wanted to be seen by the locals as their king, not a foreign king. So that their privilege, let's say their rights would be maintained, in spite of the fact that, of course, with the Frankization of Italy, there was a further privatization, as we will see now. And this was going throughout all over the same Frankish world. It is fair to say that, say, at the time of Charles Martel, the average Frank was freer than it would be under Charlemagne, and that the average Frank under Charlemagne was freer than one under Charles the Bald. Right? It's kind of obvious. There is a process of, again, stratification, of structuring, of concentration of power that we'll see now better, right? So, in all this, for us to understand, fundamentally, who was who is not easy at all, because de facto, within these relations, you could still see the richer owners to live among the poorer ones. For example, many of the, say at least some of the richer could be also very rich, right? But their wealth and the way in which they were connected to their poorer neighbors varied dramatically according to the regions, the period. And we don't have that map of Europe so clear. We can, generally speaking, understand what, again, happens on a regional basis, comparing the documents, the sources from one another, but we will never fully know what was happening properly down to the in a local provincial situation. Who was exactly at this time the richest family there, how they interacted with the rest of the people, and so on. We have to go through indirect paths in order to assess part of this. It's important to recognize that differently from the, say, sharp divide that between the freemen and the not freemen, there was also not such a thing between a sharp divide between the aristocracy and the peasantry as a whole, right? At least the freemen are more easily recognizable the more documents we get, Let's put it in this way, because where more documents were produced, generally speaking, people were freer. Like, at least they were wealthier per capita, right? In the rest, we just don't know, and we presume that the average person there was just de facto, yes, they could be free, but already being under somebody else's signory, protection, clientele, and so on. It would be typical in many ways. But as far as what is the aristocracy, right? There are entire historiographical wars fought over this topic, right? And also, what about the peasantry? In other words, with here that, say, can't afford living like mostly as a professional or semi-professional warrior, and who does just work for him and just every once in a while is levied with a rota system supplied by the other peasant neighbors, right? We don't even have a term that defines the aristocrat per se, because in their mentality it did not exist. There was not such a boundary between freemen yet. There were freemen who were much freer than others, and indeed, but there was not such an all-encompassing class called like that. In fact, the word nobilis, so the nobleman that existed in early medieval Latin, could mean important just at the local level, such as property aristocrat, or more simply even a person who is spiritually noble, right? There is this sense, for example, during the investigations when they called up witnesses, etc., that they would interview the people who were considered like the better people of the community. This is very interesting in many ways. Like, there was a sense that were people who were worthier than others, that had already more power than others, but also in a moral sense, because they went in parallel with both those two things. But it could really vary much, right? There are even more frequent but also more vague expressions, such as potentiores, which means the most powerful, which witnesses also the difficulties that early medieval writers themselves at the time encountered in defining such category. Because how do you explain, really, how powerful a person is? Because these people may be even more powerful without being necessarily more rich, right? And there was obviously these were people that obviously was status, as we would say, aristocratically, why it was not discussed, right? For example, they clothed differently. They ate more fats and proteins, because they could have a lifestyle which they could hunt, for example, on a more regular basis. Not like, again, the Irish peasant could hunt one, right? A few, because it costs to hunt, right? Not like in hunting parties, but somebody hunts for you also at some time, by some degree, and as you are the leader. But they also led the armies, the units in battle, but and especially they were strictly connected with the king. This was, especially in the Carolingian world, very, very, very clear, right? And Charlemagne, also to counter the power of the nobility, was in fact making new aristocrats among maybe quite humble warriors, exactly because still by that time it wasn't such a great distinction between freemen conceptually that could be accepted politically and juridically applicable. But also initially, right, in the first centuries, anyone who had accumulated a lot of land and was in some cases known to the king could, in line of principle, become a potentiator. And as I understand, this was in fact quite convenient for the kings themselves. They could choose, as we just said, whoever they wanted, also to cover some important public office and so on. And this concept would have been practically even impossible to imagine, for example, for the 12th century, because by that time it would have been even illegal, right, to call like a nobleman who wasn't, right, in a technical sense. For example, even in other parts of Europe, in Germany after the 13th century, you couldn't, right? There was a rigid divide. And that's what we were talking about before. It's exactly within those countries that had originally brought about the sense of kind of more undistinguished freedom that actually divides, kind of sclerotized the most during the Middle Ages, and would last throughout all the ancient regime. This is very powerful. I made a video about the life and times of Conrad II the Salian, in which we described what, 1000 AD Germany what really was. Most people were technically somebody else's people, and this was very different from other places. So at a local level, the greater or lesser power depended on, say, more on the local properties, of course, and on the private influence of the people than any abstract juridical special right. Again, it was quite concretely perceived, because also initially there was no romanticism about these definitions. People had historically been less divided as long as they had stayed in a semi-nomadic situation. But we're also less regulated, and power was power, just how they saw it, and that's how also these clan leaders emerged to rule over people's entire. And when the land came about, it's obvious that whoever had more land was even more evidently characterizable throughout this powerful stage. In particular, the aristocrats at this time didn't have, say, by Carolingian times, in spite of the fierce privatization of Carolingian public culture, they didn't have yet those specific legal powers associated to their own social position. Right, this was mostly start in the 10th century, when there is properly a military class that is established, that basically all over Europe recognizes itself as such, the milites, right? And in fact, the royal justice administered more or less in this local public assemblies known as placita, because placet means it's liked by, right? And so if the king liked it, it was made, was sanctioned officially as law, as at least as a judgment, right? It was mostly the capitularia that were law as such, but this system basically dominated constantly throughout all post-Western Roman Europe until the Carolingian period, and in some areas, especially in Italy, also later. This is particularly important because it shows that actually it was the most Roman areas, at least as we've seen, Italy had been unhinged by the Gothic wars in this system, but essentially there, this juridical culture kept working. Justice was being made. There was a public authority. People recognized themselves in it. There was a king. There was a royal justice. Things worked because the communities knew how to make themselves still being felt. And again, this was somehow an exception, not completely. But just to mind again that this contrast between the Germanicity of freedom and the Roman subservience allegedly was actually switched by this point, and it was just like a few, like in some areas it never even properly existed, especially the most Roman one of all. So this system is when you fully picture it, you realize that also most history, as you've been told, is not as you thought it was, right? We live through these cliches and we somehow pretend them to be true. But the documents speak clearly about this. And we will see it in depth in some other videos. That one about from Colony to Massari was quite eloquent, telling the truth, because it shows how the peasantry was kind of better off than many other areas without even there being, any other reason than simply, again, the common sense of just as people were productive, they lived in that way, and they had maintained their own autonomy. So all this means that we have to evaluate with greater care the documents relative to the riches and to aristocratic power, and especially minding about how they varied the one from the other. Right, the richest aristocrats had been the senators of late antiquity, such as Petronius Maximus, whose father had spent 4,000 pounds of gold for his Praetorian Games that basically sanctioned the entrance in the political arena of the science of the senatorial order. We're talking about the 20s of the 5th century, so where the Roman system was fully standing. And this was, again, the norm, right? Such large amount of money. In the early Middle Ages, nobody, except the kings, and not even all of them in Romano-Germanic Europe, could reach that level of wealth. Even if Bertrand was the bishop of Le Mans, in his testament that dates to 650 AD, so pretty early. By the way, these are some of kind of the darkest times. Had left some private properties that had been inherited, bought or granted by the king, among which you could count more than 80 tenures that stretched in Gaul from Paris to Bordeaux. This is a very good example of how rich the Gallo-Frankish aristocracy really was. But it's the exception also in here, right? For example, for Visigothic Spain, we don't know enough. That's another interesting side of the story. The Iberian Peninsula escapes an important degree of such measurements. While in Longobard Italy and in Anglo-Saxon England, the entity of the aristocratic fortunes was definitely much less to the one of Gaul. On the other hand, it's likely that Bertram's asset dimension were not in fact typical for aristocracy, not even for the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, right? At least for the Merovingian times. In Carolingian times, it would expand dramatically, but the Merovingian times, especially at this point, there had been a brusque contraction, properly of the political and territorial power, even just of the branches of the same Merovingian dynasty itself. So the sources of which that we have indicate the existence of a consistent amount of landowners that possess just one comitatus or two, right? The comitatus would stand for the ancient pagus / gau, but especially in Gaul and in Italy, something like a provincial district, like a city district with a town and a diocese, right? This was not huge, right? This is more or less, however, it gives you an idea of the extent of what aristocratic power could arrive to be. And territorially and politically, actually this was not a real dominion, right? There were other people there that had power, and you weren't quite over enough, like to the point of having this kind of good provincial personal lordship like you would have in especially let's say in Carolingian, post-Carolingian Europe. So this a very standard feature in pretty much everywhere in the Latin West, right? Before the mid-8th century, the power of these people was exercised in this one or two comitatus, mostly on essentially the tenants that lived on these people's land, and on naturally their military retinues that were quite important. In fact, these were the Antrustiones / Trustes in Gaul and the Gazindi in Italy, right? There are differences between the Antrustiones and the Gazindi, between the Franks and the Longobards. I can't explain fully in this video why, but we will discuss it at some point. Say just that the Antrustiones were reflecting that kind of more private and military character of the retinues, the lord's retinues, while the Gazindi were some sort of kind of more civil, social kind of connection that the king had locally, right? They were also military in nature, but and the Antrustiones had these functions as well, right, by a degree. But as we've seen, the two countries are substantially different. The way they were connected with the king and the way their same retinues were connected with them was through loyalty, land assignation. The important fact, though, is that before the Carolingian era, such aristocrats didn't have always a direct authority on the peasants that inhabited on the boundaries of their property. Right. This is something again that starts happening with the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, mostly, and so with the collapse of public authority, the privatization of the system, the greater political instability, the fact that the Franks had basically now created a dramatic military machine that now went overstretching the empire and conquest, had practically now would start turning from towards the inside to eat as much as they could, right? So in this very destabilized situation with the second invasions and so on, also the peasants basically said, we want to be protected by these guys, and they gradually lost their own autonomy, right? Before this time, aristocracies were powerful, of course. They ruled the world through their clienteles and so on, but these clienteles were made up of people that also had substantial rights on their own that they could defend by a degree. And also because these aristocracies were not even as powerful. Consider that by the second half of the 8th century, we see the full revival of European economy. Right, so even the power, like the accumulation of wealth from those who were just better placed to earn, increased later. You literally have to create the means for that. In fact, everything changed with the Carolingian era. After 751 in Gaul and after 774 in Italy, the situation would have, albeit gradually, changed. Right. In other words, the rich became ever richer in both countries. Right. Two factors, as we've seen, stimulated this thing. From one side, there was also this character, the loot accumulated during the victorious wars of Charlemagne. Right. So that the Franks began to plunder, sack, to reinvest locally, especially in the most strategic areas of the empire. And the promotion from the Carolingians, also of a group of families that were fundamentally originally from Austrasia, the Rhineland in today's kind of northeastern France or Benelux, that would in fact be allocated in the most strategically important locations of the empire. A good example is provided by the families of the Guidonids that were originary of the Moselle area, and that became famously both dukes of Spoleto in central Italy, that lords of the Brittonic Mark in northwestern Gaul. Right? So there are a few families, very powerful ones, that came from the Frankish heartland and were some of the ancestors of the most important, in fact, nobiliar families in Europe, as they started becoming such from there. And the responsibility, the government responsibility relative to great territories, offered remarkable chances to widen illegally to the basis of their power, to grow their personal riches also under the most powerful kings, because again, the Carolingian Empire was so big, it was so private that it worked through. Just, I give you this land that we conquered by force, and I leave you here. If you're faithful to me, I will keep rewarding you with other tasks. Basically, you're much less checked by anyone to do whatever you want locally. So that's how also locals began to lose power, practically. Another factor that played in a similar way was the brusque expansion, roughly around the same time, of the ecclesiastical property. And this happened for multiple reasons. In part, the need of the same aristocracy to, in fact, found more strongly their own private power. So their propension from essentially the 8th century to found their own monasteries and endowing them with landed properties, following essentially the example of the kings of the previous century. This is also fascinating because they didn't really invent anything new. The Merovingians did the same. But there was more surplus now, and they could found simply these monasteries that had some immunities. As such, they were staffed essentially by their own heirs, like their cadets, their daughters, also to save money from the dowry, to concentrate power further, and that's why all this thing was becoming dynastic, right, in lineage, with trying to also not to split equally the inheritance among all the various children, was the cause basically for the collapse of both the Merovingian and the Carolingian empire, at least given these premises of private nature, public authority, public culture, fundamentally. Between, say, the mid-8th century and the early 9th, the donations to churches and monasteries from the side of all social strata, let's say, with the reinforcement of the papacy, the establishment of properly an imperial church, right, under the Carolingians, rendered it possible the landed property of the church to amount to 1/3 of the entire available land. This gives you a dimension also of the massive involvement of abbots and bishops in the administration of the empire, and also how they had practically already de facto been throughout all the early Middle Ages, controlling territories that basically were the same size of the one of the aristocrats, also considering that they came from the same aristocratic families themselves, and thus developing their hegemony in very similar ways and in most cases, actually the same lifestyle, especially when bishops were less, in the areas of more recent Christianization, the bishops were just an equivalent to the lay lords in practice, also for the administration of the land. But pretty much everywhere they militarized notoriously, and they fundamentally acquired a role which was the one of the defenders of their own community during the second invasions, etc. But 1/3 of the available land belonged to the church at this point. And this was also extremely functional to the system, as we will explain better also in other videos, but there is a medieval Christianity playlist that explains, especially, I think I made a video about the Carolingian church, or actually an entire playlist I dedicated to that. Various topics related to this one specifically, where you can look at to kind of focus better on the whole thing. So the increase in riches within the essentially the establishment in Italy and in Gaul had an impact also on the international traffics, right? There was essentially, thanks to the more hierarchical system and the concentration of power, in fact, a greater concentration of, say, agricultural surplus. It mostly was the same power itself, the same wealth. Thus, you could sell actually things much more easily, much more organically, much more rationally, because it's much easier to organize that if you have, again, a single guided, more or less, directions the entire resources, direct the entire resources, than much of scattered peasants that do not have some kind of superstructure and that are always quarreling with each other. This is especially true for the luxury products as well that were acquired thanks to this massive exports. Like Carolingian Europe mostly exported horses, weapons, agricultural resources as well, and they would get back, precious clothes, technological devices by a degree, spices, these kind of things. So the economic growth of the 9th century turns out to be, at least in part, the simple effect of a new further enrichment of the richer strata of the population. Not only, again, there was seemingly a general revival, different factors, even the fact you can stabilize an entire area with such a military deterrent represented by a renewed military aristocracy. It's a big deal, because you can, again, direct more resources at the same time in a more rational unitary direction. You have an empire in the first place, since the fall of the Western Roman one, that it acts as one, at least for a good while, and thus that can keep simply an internal peace. That was a huge deal. Before, there were just all different kingdoms, right? And that also wrote differently. They had different scripts. They were administered differently. Now the uniformation of at least this bigger system, as rough as it was, right? It was nothing dramatically advanced, but especially in northern Gaul and in northern Italy, you do find through the polyptychs, for example, the Carolingian era, really very advanced system of land exploitation and also diversification of products, right? But in general, it worked. It was simple but effective, right? This greater concentration of riches occurred, of course, because independent peasants had now becoming more bent to the authority. But at the same time, it functionalized, guys. It lost less energy as far as a civilizational establishment was possible. Now, some say eventually during the 9th century the system declined as well. So surely the Carolingian conquest was brutal, was, just it impacted, it kind of unhinged certain realities, right? So in the 9th century, Carolingian legislation, you can find certain juridical cases witnessing the oppression of the poor from the side of the aristocrats, that at least the law said, it shouldn't happen. It was basically the first need also, the first problem also among the previous, that the Merovingian or the Longobard laws. The problem was to avoid that certain privates would simply take advantage of the weaker, right? It was a broader principle, so underlying chivalry and the entire sense that, if you had a power to counter that, and that was the moment to show you were in charge. So that's why kings existed, even in this traditional world, because they were called to perform that function in the face of a world that was aging and degenerating, and just by prophecy, right, by worldview. Naturally, this aristocratic power was, however, in many ways the face of the establishment as well, right? So, the idea is that the more at the top you were, the more you would try to make the system work well, right? This is evident from the major Carolingian rulers. I mean, you wanted to keep the system not collapsing. The collapse began from the bottom up, because you couldn't control all the various vassals as you would have liked, but it really started at a very local level, where you gave land to these horsemen just for their service of a lifetime, but then these would see this land as their own now, not the king's, when it technically still was, juridically, by Romano-Germanic tradition. And who could dislodge them from there if they were the same armed wing of the king? Right? That's how basically the Carolingian Empire collapsed. Right? But it also was laying the basis for that sense of more kind of hierarchically organized local administration that would tendentially maintain the sense of, again, a unitary leadership that had to be framed into an ever higher hierarchical system that could keep expanding as a power, as an empire. This would come back essentially by the second half of the 10th century, the 11th century, when the entire West at this point, also of course many cities, many other peasant communities participated to the expansion of that world, still with an important degree of autonomy. As we were saying the other day in the video about the Alien, in 841 there was even a major revolt in the Eastern Frankish kingdom known as the Dispelling revolt. This mostly was centered in Saxony, but not only. Part of the reason is that Saxony, as most of the areas behind across the, those that had not been colonized by the Merovingians, that were of recent conquest, were characterized by a weak aristocracy. This had remained, again, in depressed areas fundamentally, but with that more sense of that the freemen could still counter successfully an aristocrat from taking over the system. The Carolingians had conquered them, and now they were engineering the development of a stronger aristocracy, and so the peasantry, both the freemen and the serfs combined, rebelled against the aristocrats. Naturally, they were put down, right? And the aristocracy took over, right? So that was, generally speaking, the trend of Europe anyhow, right? And not, again, too much great problem, because the more north and east you go, and the worse definitely the thing is comparatively. So you can have great feudal kingdoms, but it's not that people are living in chains while, among the tribes they're free. Again, it's the same thing we're going before. It's a kind of optical illusion, right? On which it's mostly based, basically what people say today about again this kind of revivalism of tribalism. It's BS, right? It's basically going backwards towards a weaker state of the world, and in great part of the same people, because they couldn't do anything better. I mean, we're not empires being born there, ruling, prospering. No, it was just a miserable reality with people basically just killing each other on a regular basis, without much possibility of stability in the first place, right? So hardly, the paradise of freedom and of what you would like to replicate nowadays. And the interesting thing about this is in fact that free peasants kept existing for also essentially another couple of centuries, where you would think mostly in the tribal, would it have the areas of being tribal? No. Mostly in Italy and in southern Gaul. Right? Doesn't matter how ever more exposed to the dominion of aristocrats were, still they were autonomous, still they enjoyed a status, a life quality and a political autonomy that was basically not known by people of that kind of social level anywhere in Europe. Proving what? Proving, of course, that these areas were historically more developed, richer, had managed to maintain, in spite of all this feudalization that was undergoing further, their own strength as freemen, like properly as a mindset. So that at the beginning of the year of the 11th century would have, this deeply ingrained sense that in the Italic kingdom, people from Romano-Germanic times were freemen, and as such still noblemen, because they had the right to bear arms, they had their own army within the same cities. Whereas you look at Salian Germany and you see that basically most peoples are somebody else's people. And there is not even much of a clear, say, interest in to distinguish them further, but just in realizing that was the order of things. And see it even from the perspective of half of a millennium of change. The adaptation to these realities is not just, again, they flipped from what they were 500 years before. There was evidently already something that had ingrained in these people, something that was already much felt at the time. What was necessarily the confidence about personal success in a place like Central Europe throughout the early medieval centuries, as opposed to, somebody living in a city of the Italic kingdom, right? Even in this, we have wanted to tendentially flip the thing in popular culture. We think that, was better to live a Viking than those damned Christians in the continent, right? Because you're freer. Freer to live how? Right? In perennial instability, in perennial violence, in places where you can't even start centralizing. Basing your expectations of growth on plundering more stable systems that in the end survived as stronger system than yours. Pick England, pick France, and that's not really a positive thing. That's not a model you want to pursue. And in fact, they changed and they adopted, without even being conquered, the same system: Christianity, feudalism. And needless to say, things are starting to go substantially better there too, from there on. again, speak to the average kid nowadays and ask them essentially what they think about the Middle Ages. Or how about the social differences between the various regions of Europe. They don't know anything. But I mean literally nothing. Not even a minimal glimpse of a trace of anything. This thing properly is being completely removed by the awareness of Western civilization. We have created essentially a fanatic fourth estate or a religion in which the poorer and more stupid and more ignorant you are and more, pure you're supposed to be. This is called Gnosticism. It easily gets down also to communism at a social, political level. And that's what happens at the fringes of civilization. It doesn't happen among prosper people. And of course, we're sinking because these people have stopped basically caring about themselves as well, which is exactly what happened by a degree also with the affirmation of feudalism in those systems. We see it now, but that still allowed the elite that had control to maintain some standards for the rest of the people to live better than in other countries, which is what we're technically trying to do here, right? You can legitimately be angered by things like, I don't know, transgender ideology or the Green Deal, all this kind of, objectively ridiculous stances. But you cannot argue that the systems on which that we are based function thanks to the system as it is and as it works now. Because the rest of the world is just garbage, to say the least. And there's not much around this that you can go, right? It's and it does stem also, by the way, from such things that happen in European history that we thought we learned, right, over time, and not, attributing to an incredibly superficially identitary character that nobody really understands what kind of merit should own by itself. So that's in my opinion, the non-intuitive, the counterintuitive meaning of and power and reason of civilization. Right? You can't really have anything if you don't sacrifice something else, and through that sacrifice you will step up. The idea here is that nobody wants to make any sacrifice, and so they will simply just sink. This is what the history of civilization has taught us continuously, without any exception. So we are in a state in which, we can definitely consider ourselves privileged, and that, however, stems from a historical reality that must be known, cannot be made up as one wishes. Simple. So, speaking of the privatization of judiciary powers too, again, I made a lot of videos on the seigneurial system, how it came to be, how it worked. So I will not repeat excessively myself. However, under Charlemagne and his immediate successors, where that power was still illegal, that sense of, you couldn't usurp royal prerogatives, basically royal rights. Well, after the end of the Carolingian Empire, right, during especially the first half of the 10th century, the structures of political power, given that the system had somehow collapsed, were the ones that took on a more marked and ever better defined physiognomy from a legal point of view, everywhere in post-Carolingian Europe. This is particularly important as well because it shows how the system didn't quite collapse as such. Right? I mean, the power of the church, its cultural impact, right? The fact that Europe felt basically as as part of this whole thing that still was seen in imperial ways, with the better definition of universal powers on its way, right, was the recipe of, again, most of that kind of Western identity that we have completely rejected nowadays, even in the allegedly conservative environments that have practically nothing about traditional European identity. These systems, so in other words, the establishment of a local aristocracy that could take matters in its own hands in the wake of the kind of the shortcoming of public power, became visible in different ways. The privatization of the judiciary powers that were connected naturally with huge revenues that had historically been part of the Romano-Germanic fisc, right? The public demand, and again, as we were saying before, it had already gone eroded during early medieval times. Just at this point, it was still salvaged in as much as, again, civilization didn't collapse, and these were still the basis from which everybody had to boost, to maintain the system at least, and to boost it further later on. How they solved it in a very simple way, right? They privatized the system. It tended to overlap with the comitatus, that is to say, with the juridical power of the counts, so that ruled these districts, usually with a town and a diocese, right? That overlapped in the Roman system, becoming in the 10th century the inheritance, basically, of specific comital families, right? That were sanctioned like that, you know. Think about the Capitulary of Quercy-sur-Oise, and then the Capitulary of Conrad II, the Salian, right? The Dictum de Beneficis of. That's where both the major and the minor fiefs were considered hereditary, properly by law, because that was a fait accompli, right? It simply depicted reality, how it had come to be in those last generations. This thing would eventually at least stick around the comitatus throughout the 10th century, because the system was feeble enough to prevent for larger larger dominations to exist. Eventually, in the 11th century, this system evolved, in part fragmented in itself further, that is to say, creating smaller seigneuries, some territorial ones, the ones that, for example, in French are defined as the seigneurie banale. I made a video about the banal lordships. In fact, the power of which was essentially military in nature, sort of martial control, the mobilization of the locals that had agreed with this pact for reasons of self-defense, and thus giving their freedom, part of their juridical, at least liberty, let's put it better, in order to be protected, and to create this military class from which the milites would emerge to eventually pave the way to take what we call feudalism. This seigneury extended basically around a castle, and so thus the relative lord that inhabited there. Again, big topic. I'm making it very simple, but this is for the sake of tracing the juridical path. So these seigneuries essentially had detained their own tribunals, private tribunals, that had come into existence just through, again, the shortcoming of public authority, and allowed these lords to claim a jurisdiction both on the small landowners and on the tenants. So both on all the population, both freemen and non-freemen. This didn't mean that the idea of freedom was eliminated from the picture at all. There was always a sense of who was free and who was not free. We've seen it very clearly in many areas of Europe. In any case, feudalism at this point became hegemonic. That is to say, you could have a space within the system, it could be even quite wide if you were kind of a florid community. But kingdoms were also gradually restarting to grow, principalities, and so you were within that system. And you had all the interest to support it, to maintain stability locally after the great crisis followed the fall of the Carolingian Empire. In some areas of Europe, even the environment was influenced by this. For example, during the 10th century, especially the beginning, there was the properly planned creation of consistent settlements of population within the walls of castles or of cities. For example, this is true for central Italy, between Siena and Naples, for example, or Languedoc and Provence. It's very meaningful that these are the same areas that we were saying before, Italy and southern Gaul, that were the ones where actually people remain freer. Right? So this tells you the degree of cooperation that existed actually between, and so not mere imposition behind the development of such powerful political territorial realities. Because again, fortifying a city like Siena, for example, think about the Marquises of Tuscany, the Canossas, right? We still have to talk about them, but it would be also an era of power of cities, of citizens. This essentially in the following centuries would see the rise of the communes. So it's not a form of weakness to actually cooperate with choosing a power that works for you. Actually, it may be, like in this case, the key to boost your power further. And this is exactly the point I was making before regarding Western civilization. We come from this very realities. Other things that happened, for example, had to do with the subdivision of the settlements of say, with a context of systematic reorganization, even properly of the landscape, according to the method of the 3-year land rotation. This was typical of especially the northern areas, Western Germany, Northern Gaul, and England. Right, these were the areas where actually the peasantry was being brought down more heavily. And so you see that literally here you have the feudal lords deporting people, right, which is a very different thing in terms of contractual power from what we just exposed about Southern Europe. Also here there was a degree of cooperation. This was not like, concentration camps or whatever, but it was still more consistently brutal, right? And properly done by feudal landlords over rural population that was historically under, by different degree, but still, fundamentally tending towards a sense of, again, being under a feudal lord. I made a video also about, for example, the peasantry in the English countryside during the 12th to 13th century. They didn't have much power objectively, right? So again, every land should be looked at in detail. We will do it in another video, but you can't check this stuff out from my, for example, medieval England playlist or medieval Britain playlist. There are varied medieval society. There's all of that. Again, the rural history playlist is also quite easy for this specific topics to find. So it's obvious that in these northern examples, these processes of reorganization are an important mark in the development of coercive power locally. Right? These are exactly the areas where feudalism would blossom more markedly, and paradoxically, the one from which the most compact powers would emerge, especially France and England, but also as far as, let's say, the German monarchy during the 12th century, the Rhineland, the more developed regions of Western Germany, were, places where also there was an important degree of hierarchy of public power and so on. So this is also very telling. Those were great powers for medieval European standards. Again, what do you want? Do you want more power or less liberty? I mean, it's something you have to, because they always struggle with one another. It was never easy to make this thing work smoothly. But here we are concentrating on probably how engaged the population really was, and how much power they had, at least, to oppose themselves or to make these things happen in the first place. And again, the most striking divide is that while this was happening, starting from the year 1000, but in that video about the Longbird Massari, even from before, the rural serfdom disappeared in southern Europe. Rural serfdom remained in northern Europe. Rural serfdom disappeared in southern Europe. Reflect about this, right? Because when you think again about what normally say, there was a change that brought to reversal the switch. The Romans were basically knocked out. There was somebody else who was commanding. In which way exactly? And which people are we talking about? Because the data here is remarkably clear about the fact that the northern parts of Europe actually saw more loss in individual freedom throughout this time, and while the southern ones actually increased their own freedom. We're talking about liberty in both cases, of course, because otherwise we would have not had a European civilization. Freedom in itself doesn't lead anywhere if it doesn't, again, set itself some limitations to self-sacrifice. All these areas were under some kind of feudal power, right? But in Southern Europe, it would be normal to say, I'm a freeman by the full Middle Ages, as opposed to areas that, even though were very developed, like France, England, again, Western Germany, especially by that time, were also rising, by the way, faster than Southern Europe. We've seen it also in the medieval economy videos. But how, right, with which means and with which outcome, right? So in a world in which aristocratic power was by that point formalized, so where, for example, aristocracy is a matter of wealth rather than blood, right? Like in the Italian communes, this serfdom was kind of useless. If you could find people who just were able to support you, they had their own means, they negotiated. For example, military leagues. Different cities ruled by milites, but still cooperating and making staying out, for example, feudal powers or even the emperor. Well, it's obvious that these people would be jealous of their own freedom, their own liberty at least, because they never thought to bail out the empire in the first place. So that tells you again of how relevant this was. Times like, I don't know, the time of the investiture struggle, whatever, to boost even that Western sense of for example, the balance of powers. That is one of the foundations of our, what we call improperly, democracy, and that is actually Western civilization. Has nothing to do with the rule of the demos, but with quality, with merit, with power, with wealth as well, checks and balances, right, that are being constantly eroded nowadays. I say, we don't care anymore. We want just to you know to vote the big guy that is stupid, says dumb things, but that's exactly who I am, so I will vote. And that's how you have an increase in personal serfdom. And that's not really the best option, considering what we managed to do, that is re-enriching everyone more or less by the 20th century, so that you could hopefully understand that it's better to be all strong, right, instead of undermining our own civilization like imbeciles, right? But this is seemingly, again, what many people really seem to be preferring, which is odd. But it's exactly how it happened in the past as well. So towards the year 1000, at least, however, the boundaries of a new political aristocratic system was evident, also ever more evident, also at a local level, and it would be the acquiring, say, the purchasing power of the aristocrats, also to boost further the economical development of the following centuries. In other words, you can lose freedom in some cases, but with say call it liberty better. But if you keep it, it's better, and you can still become the richer one. But if you vote essentially for losing your own liberty, at least stop complaining about the elites, right? And not trying to pretend that you're actually gaining more power by disintegrating your own capacity to be ruled by yourself, instead than by just an average guy that nobody really understands what kind of capacity he really has, right? This is valid for both right and left wing, but at least I've seen, consistently speaking, as a right winger, also an attack from right wing to the core sense of liberty that we managed to maintain in place, which I don't understand, except in the ignorance of these people that in fact look much more socialist to me than right wingers. But that's welcome to the realization that nationalists and socialists are always kind of the same thing, because you can't really have one without the other in whichever community you live overlapping. And I will not explain why in this video, but this is the idea overall. In any case, for today, I stop it here. We will keep talking about medieval peasantry and aristocracy and whatever. However, for today, really, that's it. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.